Today I'm going to be talking about a very unexpected tornado that impacted the small town of Bering, Missouri last week. So that day was not expected to be a particularly impactful severe weather day. You can see that the SPC has issued a slight risk for portions of Missouri and Nebraska and Kansas during that day. But if you'll notice, the actual town of Bering is located in the far northeastern portion of Missouri, so just barely within the marginal risk, kind of on the border. Certainly not, this is not the kind of outlook you'd expect like an intense tornado to occur on, but we'll talk about more of why that happened later. So if we, for example, look at the tornado probabilities, it is a small area of tornado potential, but it's localized more to like central Missouri, and in fact, the town of Bering is indeed outside the 2% risk. And if you look at like the environment, you can see that dew points and like temperature is okay. We've near the closest station to Bering, we've got a temperature of 77 and dew points of 73. That's like plenty of moisture. So that seems okay for the production of severe thunderstorms. But if we look at the actual like instability, so this is a map of the surface-based CAPE, which stands for convective available potential energy, which is basically a measure of how much energy there is in the atmosphere to produce thunderstorms. You can see that there's this contour of about 1,000 CAPE, 1,000 joules per kilogram, which is very marginal for severe weather. Like, obviously it can happen, but it's not like what you'd want to see if you're hoping for severe weather to occur. And if you look at the low-level lapse rates, which is usually an indication as to how well thunderstorms can maintain and intensify, you'll see that they are very low in the vicinity of Bering. They're kind of between like 5 and 5.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer. And usually for severe weather, you're looking at lapse rates between like 6 and 7 at the very least. So again, not indicative of storms that could produce like intense tornadoes. And so the reason that one was able to produce is because we are dealing with a mesoscale convective system. And so you can see in this later loop that we have a very rapidly spinning like storm system. And in the like later portions of the loop, you can even see like a semblance of a kind of like eye-like feature developing around here or so. And so that this looks like very similar to a tropical cyclone, even though they are forming with very different mechanisms. This is like not tropical whatsoever. But the key thing is that this rapid rotation is causing the environment nearby to have a lot of increased vorticity just because of the rapid motion. And so we have this like chain of supercells that are all moving towards like the northeast, and they're getting ingested into this high vorticity environment, which results in a very localized increase in tornado potential. And so this is what enabled the Bering tornado to form. And it's one of these individual supercells, I believe it's that one, that was what produced the tornado. So now that we see a little bit of what the environment was like that evening, we can take a look at the tornado's track and damage. So this picture shows both the SPC track, which is listed is colored in yellow, and a bunch of damage indicators, which is what I have been able to glean from like various drone pictures and pictures provided by local news outlets, as well as those taken by the local NWS office during their survey. So this was a very brief tornado. It was only on the ground for a couple of minutes, and it tracked for about 1.5 miles. It was kind of wide though. As you can see, basically the entire town got impacted to some degree. Like the swath of damage is pretty wide. Fortunately, despite this being unwarned, it wasn't at its strongest when it passed through town, and there were only 2 injuries due to this tornado. And so the official rating for this tornado, which is still preliminary, this only happened a week ago, is 122 mile an hour EF2. But we'll be taking a look at some damage indicators, particularly in this farmstead located near the beginning of the tornado track, that suggests that it almost certainly reached at least EF3 intensity. And one final thing to notice is, contrary to most tornadoes, this actually took a kind of northwestward motion, and that's because it was on the northeastern periphery of that mesoscale convective system, which is why it had this like kind of deviant motion, contrary to the usual like east or northeast or southeast motion that tornadoes usually take. And so here's a couple of helicopter pictures of that farmstead. So you can see there's a couple houses that got minor to significant damage. The house on the left definitely experienced stronger winds than the house on the right. And in between the two, we have this like very small corridor of much stronger winds. And so it seems like the tornado had like a fairly intense like subvortex in the center of it, but it was still like fairly wide at this point since it was causing damage to both of these houses. And you can see this left house a little better in this picture. And so let's take a quick look at this house. So we can see that the roof is completely gone, and like there's some walls that have been destroyed. And so this is kind of like hovering between like an EF2 and an EF3. But if we take a closer look at like the construction of this house, you can see that the walls aren't really anchored very well. Like we have like some kind of baseboard here, and there's just like a few nails sticking out of it. We don't see any evidence of like ankle bolts, at least holding this section of the wall. There might be like ankle bolts underneath this like kind of like wooden box that are holding it to the foundation, but the actual walls are not really anchored to this wooden foundation very well. So I think it's reasonable to give this house damage like an EF2 rating. Yeah, and like even though we see a bunch of bricks, as is typical with most uh homes in America, the bricks are just like a decorative veneer and not actually structural. But this is not the most intense damage at this location, at this general location. Uh, so like over here we see a few grain bins. These were like completely destroyed and they were blown away maybe like a quarter of a mile away. And you can actually see like that there were 2 ankle boat. Well, there's pictures of a few ankle boats, but presumably there's more of them evenly spaced around the perimeter. And like you can see, this one got bent, and this one got entirely ripped out of the concrete foundation. And so, obviously, this is not going to be as strong as like an ankle-boated house, just because it's just a grain bin. You don't have as many ankle boats, and you're also dealing with a structure that has very little internal structure and a very large surface area because it's essentially just a giant cylinder. So again, not too severe of damage, but still suggests like at least a strong tornado, like EF2 plus, impacted this location. Now, the most significant damage occurred to this structure, and we can see that well, it's a concrete slab, and if you look closely, you can see that we have some like wooden sill plates that are mostly broken off. There's obviously still like a few left around the perimeter of the foundation, but most of them have been broken off. And we also have some bent ankle boats. And if we take a look at a closer shot, you can see the ankle boat in a little more detail. Like it does indeed have a wassail, so that's like a good sign that it was like somewhat well constructed. Um, and if you look closely at one of the remaining stow plates, you can see that we're dealing with like wooden construction, and we have these like fairly long nails or that had attached a wooden beam. You can like vaguely see the outline of this like 2x8 or similar that was attached there. And what you can see that's the um, nails or like severely bent, suggesting that the structure above the foundation just kind of collapsed in on itself in this direction. And so some people might get a little too excited. They see like a slab with ankle bolts, the steel plates are gone, and just immediately assume like, oh, it's got to be like violent or an EF5 or something. But let's try to be a little more grounded in our approach to this situation. So if we look at what this structure originally looked like, we can see that it was a very large like garage. Um, and so there's a few things of note. Number one is it's like these very large garage doors. These are going to fail very quickly in a tornado, and all the wind is going to go right inside there very easily, and that's going to cause like severe uplift of like the roof and interior walls since like you have this huge weak point in the structure. So that's one thing that makes this like much less sturdy than like a traditional like house. And another thing to note is that since this is more of a like large garage, we have a very tall structure. This is clearly like between like 2 and 3 stories tall. And so that's going to provide a lot more surface area for the tornadic winds to impact um, the structure, even though the foundation is no sturdier than it would be if this was like a 1-story building. So combined with like these large like garage doors and the just the sheer size of the building, that makes it a lot weaker in the face of extremely strong winds. And a final thing to note is that unlike a house, this, at least from what I can tell, like this structure does not have any internal walls, which would add to the stability of the structure. So instead of like a, so it's definitely like EF5 is out of the question. There's no way you can justify it with a structure built like this. Um, you could possibly consider this violent, except that looking at like drone footage is not anywhere near the amount of like crop damage I would expect from like a violent tornado. Like a violent tornado will basically it'll leave a very clear ground scouring marks through like cornfields and stuff. So it's most likely that this was somewhere in the EF3 lane, so maybe between like 140 to 165 miles per hour, but without a clear understanding of the structure of this building, it's kind of impossible to pin it down more precisely than that. However, there are a few kind of unconventional damage indicators that are interesting to look at. So here we are looking at one side of the building, and you can see that this concrete board, which is reinforced, just like a piece of rebar, has been like completely destroyed. And winds alone, it would take incredibly strong winds to destroy a concrete board like that. But considering that these other three are like perfectly fine, it's almost certain that some debris was traveling this way, being blown by the wind, and hit the board. And if something gets hit by debris instead of just pure wind damage, then that it takes much less speed to destroy something. If like it's being hit with like like a core at like 100 miles per hour instead of just plain air at 100 miles per hour. But still, this is still suggestive that like there were extremely fast-moving projectiles in this tornado, and that's why you always need to take shelter, because even if you could survive like 100-mile-per-hour winds in like a wind tunnel or something, you're not going to survive like any significant piece of debris hitting you at that speed. So that's one interesting thing that I noticed while scanning through the damage pictures. Another thing to note was this. And so this looks like some kind of unrecognizable metal lump, but closer investigation reveals this to be the cab of a semi-truck. Um, so I do want to point out that this looks like really like violent tornado damage, but usually the cabs of modern trucks are like on air suspension, so they're not like rigidly connected to the actual chassis of the truck. So it's possible that there was just a weak point between the um, connection between the cab and the chassis of the truck. Like I assume that this was where the airbags were located, which the cab rests on for suspension. But I like this still is like a pretty significant chunk of debris that got wafted and like pretty severely mangled. So this probably took like a lot of tumbling along the ground somewhere. Just as a side note, you can see like some pipes that also got like severely and like some minor damage to the more solid metal pipes. So that's again indicative of like a pretty strong tornado. But again, like it's very hard to accurately rate stuff like this, especially since I was unable to figure out where this cab actually came from. So like it's a little tougher to tell. Like if I knew that the truck came from like this cab came from a truck, say a mile away or something, that would add some more confidence to this being like a violent tornado. But without that kind of information, I can't really say a whole lot on the exact wind speeds it required to produce this kind of damage. Fortunately, however, the tornado weakened significantly before impacting the town of Bailing. So you can see that there's like pretty widespread damage, but it's relatively minor. However, there are a couple areas of like EF2 damage located in this town, even though most of these houses have experienced like minor EF0 to EF1 damage, mostly to the roofs and stuff. So one of these is this post office over here, and another one is this mobile home, which was built here and got thrown a little bit to this direction. And so if we take a look at the original construction of the post office, you can see that this is a cinder block building, one story, pretty small. So not the like strongest structure ever. And if we look at the damage, we can see that we have basically 1.5 floors, exterior walls have been like knocked down, and perhaps some of the interior walls as well. But these kind of cinder block houses, I mean, this is not a house, but it's built pretty similarly to a house. These are not particularly strong structures, um, and like it doesn't take that strong of wind speeds to destroy something like this. So an EF2 waiting at this location seems reasonable. The other area was this mobile home. So this is a kind of interesting case because like you can see that this mobile home is built on a slab that has ankle bolts. But this is clearly a very old foundation for some other house that is been since demolished, and someone um, built their mobile home on top of it, essentially. And so these kind of, especially these single-wide mobile homes, are very vulnerable in tornadoes, and we can see that this one was basically completely destroyed. Um, yeah, mobile homes are just not safe in tornadoes of basically any intensity. Yeah, but it's interesting that there's like a couple pockets of EF2 damage in this town, even though most of it is weaker. It's possible that there were like some minor subvortices or something, but unfortunately, there's no like footage of this tornado since it happened late at night and only lasted for a couple minutes, so I can't really comment too much on like the actual structure of the tornado. It's possible that there were like some subvortices that caused this damage, but it's hard to be certain. So in conclusion, this was most likely an intense tornado, but as I've said, like since the damage indicators are kind of unconventional, it's hard to say exactly what kind of wind speed it might have had. But this tornado is a good example of some of the deficiencies in the U.S. radar system, and that is there are certain areas of the continental United States which simply do not have good radar coverage. So the issue is that since the Earth is curved, a radar beam will be looking higher and higher in the atmosphere as you go further away from it. So if, for example, we exaggerate the curvature of the Earth, and then we have like a little radar station right here, it is going to be unable to look close to the ground far away because the curvature of the Earth will simply block the beam. And so, like, somewhere over here, you're not going to be able to see that from the radar site if it's too far away. And you'll notice that in northeastern Missouri, um, in fact, there is no radar that can detect thunderstorms below 10,000 feet above ground level, which is where like tornadoes tend to happen since those form close to the surface. And so that is the main reason why this tornado did not get a tornado warning, because there's simply too much the data that you get is too uncertain to be sourced as a tornado potential and not associated with the thunderstorms in that area. And so I wish that the National Weather Service would add some more radar sites on some of these radar hosts. Like there's quite a few in like fairly populated areas of the United States still. But due to budget reasons and like it's kind of tough to produce these anymore, this seems unlikely to happen, unfortunately. And finally, it's also interesting to note that this is one of the rare cases where you have a bookend vortex, which is essentially that like kind of spiral curvy thing on top of a metascale convective system. And in rare cases like this, those can actually produce tornadoes because of the like increased vorticity surrounding them. And so this is just this combination of bad radar coverage and an unusual form of tornado genesis that um, created this event. And it's very fortunate that there were no fatalities associated with this storm, considering um, it was unwarned and it impacted a populated area. So that is very lucky. Um, but anyway, that essentially sums up my thoughts on this tornado. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for future weather-related videos.